So I wanted to show you what coding approaches I used in my study. We will talk about deductive and inductive approaches, and I used a combination of these. So what do these mean? Deductive coding means that you have some predetermined structure, theory that you want to look for in your data, and themes and categories might also come from your literature review as well. So it's basically something that you're looking for based on what you've done before the analysis. Inductive coding means that there is no predetermined theory, structure, or framework. You're looking at what themes emerge from your data. And thematic analysis and grounded theory are good examples of inductive coding. So you might use one or the other, or you might use a combination of these approaches, which is what I did, and it all depends on your research design. So my study, for instance, employed a conceptual framework. I used the digital capabilities model by JISC, which categorizes digital capabilities into 6 elements. So in my data, I looked for points when engineers or managers discuss technology use. I then associated them with either of the 6 elements in my model. At the same time, I also relied on an inductive approach. I looked for themes that emerged from my data, but which did not exist in my deductive coding structure. So let us turn to the Nvivo database now, and I'll show you examples of both. So as I mentioned in my conceptual framework, I was looking for the different digital capabilities that engineers and managers use. So for instance, I was looking for when engineers or managers might have referred to using some communication or collaboration technologies. And as you see, then I coded my transcripts accordingly. So if you click on communication and collaboration, it will come up with all the references and all the data sources that were coded as such. So for instance, if I scroll down here, you see Thomas, one of my lecturers, is talking about when engineers, students had to be very good at communication and collaboration. So then I coded this element under my pre-existing node structure that is come from the model I was using. My other aspect of my conceptual framework was the concept of signature pedagogies, which is something that Schulman identified as pedagogies that are signature to that particular discipline. And in Schulman, he identifies 3 levels: implicit, deep, and surface, in the domain of signature pedagogies. So implicit is about the values of the discipline, deep is about the knowledge structures and how knowledge is created in that discipline, and surface is the actual learning activities that perhaps engineers or managers might be, managing students might be subjected at. So in my data, I was looking to identify these signature pedagogies in both engineering and management. So these were my deductive codes, or as they are called in Nvivo, they were my nodes. And so this was my deductive coding. There was also, however, emerging themes. So there were also codes that or nodes that I used which did not exist before I started data analysis. For instance, I later grouped these in one place under emerging themes. So these were the emerging themes here. And so whereas there were other ones that came up, as these ones I came up when I was going about the data analysis. So for instance, one of the emerging themes that came up is how different companies or organizations, so you see here, might have different digital capability needs for students or engineers. So I came to find that when students or lecturers were actually considering that global companies might use different higher spec software than small businesses, and so the capabilities in terms of what students need to be developing had to reflect that they can end up in either setting. So this idea of organizations or companies influencing the kinds of digital capabilities students needed to acquire is something that came up a few times, so I created a note for it to reflect that. Another emerging theme was international students. So here you see international students having 15 references. So this idea was that lecturers or other people were saying that students might display different attitudes or behaviors or capabilities, and sometimes that was the fact to do with that they were international students or they were home students. So you see that, for instance, in other ways as well. So these emerging themes is obviously inductive coding, but for instance in the deductive coding, when I started off with a finite framework, I also then ended up finding that there were within either my model or in signature pedagogies that there were CDIO or conceive, design, implement and operate came up as a signature pedagogy of engineering, and because it came up quite a lot of times, I then created a note for it. So here you can see that although this started off as a deductive structure, I also then amended it and created a note for it. So what I would also say that the coding process is a thinking process. It's not linear. It's something that evolves. It's messy. So you might take trodden paths. So for instance, the deductive codes, the existing framework that you might code against, or you might create new roads, which is basically identifying your emerging codes and categories. Or sometimes it can land you blind alleys or alleys that are not that then well trodden. So you might create certain nodes. So for instance, here I created the technology names, but then didn't really end up using them that much as I went forward. So this is a reflection of that messy thinking. And what you can see here, that I actually ended up trying to create some order that worked for me, because that's the only thing about Nvivo, that it works alphabetically. So the way I cheated is just put the things that I wanted at the bottom as Z, and then putting numbers for things that I wanted at the top. And that was just pure, it made sense to me this way. So at the end of the day, what you want to achieve is refining your nodes, and you will be thinking, rethinking and refining your nodes and going back to your research design, whilst also being true to what emerges from your data. And I also found that when I wrote up my thesis, that I had to be selective and focus on particular narratives and analysis. So this means that you might not get to talk about all your codes and categories and the relationships between them. So for instance, you saw something that here I didn't really consider them in my narrative. But in fact, things get exciting is when you start exploring relationships between your data. What is it actually telling you? So for me, the excitement was about trying to match up whatever happening was here in my one aspect of my conceptual framework, the kind of technologies people were using, and then the signature pedagogies, how and why we might be teaching students in particular ways in engineering and management, and what can we tell about the relationship of the discipline as compared with the technologies and the digital capabilities it requires. So that's another aspect that we will explore a little bit further in the next video. So I hope that here I gave you a little bit of a flavor of the coding approaches and how I use them for my study. So as I mentioned, this is my coding structure in Nvivo, and I use deductive and inductive coding. One of my peers on my course, Meg, and she provided these for your benefit as well. So she did almost the slightly opposite way. So first she did inductive coding and identified these themes. So she was looking at Twitter practices of librarians, and these were the themes and the sub-themes that she uncovered. And you can see a little bit here, for instance, for one of the themes, which was context. And then what she did with the inductive analysis is then she was then mapping it against a predetermined theory or framework of these, the practices, the knowledge practices of librarians according to the deductive codes, which were invisibility, roots, culturality, or skill. So basically she took the inductive themes and mapped them against those four deductive codes that she predetermined from her theory and the literature before. And then here is Phil, another member of our cohort 8, and again Phil did a similar combination of identifying, so he used change lab and activity theory, and he basically did the similar. He had a number of inductive coding, and then as you can see if you know a little bit about activity theory, that he was then also coding his transcripts and whatever was going on in the session in his research by those theoretical framework. And then here you see a little bit about the inductive categories. But as I mentioned at the beginning, your coding approach will really be determined by your theoretical framework and your methodology in terms of the whole research design.